Bestes. Good morning, everybody. I have the pleasure to welcome you here in Basel, and I have to apologize to be so in time. We have already passed 9 by 1 or 2 minutes, and we're in Switzerland, and you know this is an important task to keep this very dense time schedule, because there are many interesting papers before us. There are an important lunch break before us we shouldn't miss, and the most important thing, there is it's evening the Generalprobe of the Torelli program, which is in fact the main purpose to organize this Studientag about Torelli. I'm just here in German, the word is Grüß August. I just here to say hello. My name is Martin Kirnbauer. I'm representing the board of the Schola. I thank you all for coming and contributing for this. At the moment, there are mostly the speakers here, some guests, a few students, because some of them are playing, and 9 o'clock in the morning is not the perfect moment to start. And I would also like to thank a foundation, Meyer Sacher Foundation, who is helping us to organizing these events, the Studientag as well as the, let's say, concert, but the concert tomorrow evening is just the outcome of 1 week intense working with Enrico Gatti, who is here in co-teaching with our trumpet and violin teachers and other people involved for this Torelli project. And I would like to thank Agnese Pavanello, who organized all this, and she has much more to say about what will follow today and about the content. My part with the introduction, which is just a formal one, is herewith to end. Agnese.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much. Yes, I would like also to welcome all our guests to this study day on Giuseppe Torelli. Giuseppe Torelli holds a special significance here in Basel, not only today thanks to all those involved in this project and to the support of our head team and the Maria Sacher Stiftung, but also because of two important figures who deeply engage with this music, Eduard Tarr and Franz Gigling. Eduard Tarr, who was a trumpet player and a professor at our institution for almost 30 years, had a profound interest in Torelli, particularly in his trumpet works. He prepared editions of Torelli trumpet compositions, which are still in use today, making Torelli's name well known, at least among trumpet players. A critical edition of Torelli's work is still, don't not yet exist and still lacking. But this edition, yes, are existent. So we have this music at least in some editions. Frank Gigling was a Swiss musicologist who dedicated his doctoral thesis to Torelli in 1937, published in a book 2 years later. He worked under difficult circumstances during the Second World War without direct access to the sources. However, he was able to use reproductions collected by Bernhard Paumgartner, an Austrian conductor, composer, and musicologist, founding member and president of the Salzburger Festspiele. On Gigling's work, although it is an expression of the approach of the historiography of the time, remains a fundamental reference for anyone studying Torelli. Gigling transcribed Torelli's compositions into full score, copying them directly from the separate instrumental parts. And these studies materials are now preserved in our library in accordance, and the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis Musikakademie is therefore, so to speak, a personal one, as this is tied to individual associated to our institution. But this is also the place where the study of these works, particularly his trumpet repertoire, I have to say, have found a continuous to find lively and lasting interest. Torelli left a significant mark on instrumental music in the late 17th and 18th centuries. His contribution to the development of the orchestral repertoire at a time where the first collections of concertos and concerti grossi were being printed was already recognized in early studies on the origins of the modern instrumental practice. Today we will hear new perspectives on this topic. Among the many possible approaches for this conference day, we have chosen to focus on Torelli's orchestral works while also offering insights into different areas of research. Tomorrow evening, as already was said, we will have the opportunity to hear his music in concert, and also today with the general rehearsal at 6 p.m. And this program includes pieces from his printed collections as well as works transmitted in manuscript form. Torelli's printed collections for ensemble have attracted particular attention for their innovations, especially its Opus 6 and Opus 8, which will be key points of discussion today. However, his many manuscript compositions is particularly valuable since they offer insights into orchestral practice in Bologna, particularly at San Petronio, where Torelli served. And these manuscripts held in the archives of San Petronio are of exceptional importance, as they allow us to reconstruct orchestral performance practices from a time where separate instrumental parts have rarely survived. So this crucial aspect will also be explored today. So thank you for your participation. I'm already finished with my few introduction words, and yes, we can already start if we are in time. Yes, good. Then I will introduce our first speaker, Giulia Giovani. Giulia Giovani is Associate Professor for Musicology and Music History at the University of Siena. She has been research fellow at the Hochschule der Kunst in Bern with the project Creating the Neapolitan Canon, Music and Music Theory between Paris and Naples in the early 19th century. Her research centers especially on music printing and publishing in 17th and 18th centuries, on vocal music, especially on cantatas, and many other topics on this in this time frame. But recently, she also published a book with the letters of Giacomo Antonio Perti, the teacher of Torelli. That's why he's the best candidate to speak about Bologna in this time and introduce Torelli for us for this perspective. Yes, thank you, Giulia, for being here.
Hello, good morning, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank Agnese Pavanello for the kind invitation. Since I'm speaking in front of scholars and friends who usually work with Bolognese sources, I must admit I feel somewhat uneasy about providing an overview of the city as Agnese asked me. At the same time, I believe it is crucial to keep in mind the many places and institutions that, during the years we are focusing on, shaped Bologna. In fact, as context deeply influence artistic phenomena, it is impossible to talk about the flourishing of a Bolognese music tradition without considering the city's strong demand for music and, at the same time, the significant temporary or permanent emigration that marked the lives of many composers and performers. In particular, the knowledge of the main institutions of the city is essential to understanding how Giuseppe Torelli was drawn to Bologna and how the city provided him with recognition and long-standing popularity. We are obviously talking about the popularity a composer of instrumental music could achieve, not the fame usually reserved for composers of operas in 17th century Italy. My presentation will therefore be divided in two parts. The first will focus on theaters, academies, places of worship, and workshops that were central to Bologna's music history between the mid-17th century and the first decade of the 18th century. And the second, shorter part, will be specifically dedicated to Torelli and how his involvement in the Bolognese community contributed to his fame both inside, and outside the city walls. While the first part of the presentation is the result of an extremely synthesis of a rather extensive bibliography in the field of history, economics, and obviously musicology, the second part is based on epistolary sources related to Torelli's master and kind friend, Giacomo Antonio Perti. Let us begin then with a rather detailed map of Bologna. This one, dating 1663, was created in Amsterdam by Jean Bleu for the Senato of the city. It shows Bologna about 20 years before Giuseppe Torelli's arrival from Verona, with its over 170 churches and chapels, public and noble palaces, as well as a forest of towers. The state of the city depicted here reflects the deep changes that occurred in the early modern period with the first ongoing attempt to construct the grand porticos outside the city. As you know, as the depiction of the city introduced changes such as the burial of canals that began in the early 17th century, major transformation will occur during the Napoleonic era, when many religious buildings were transformed, and around the time of Italian unification, with the creation of large Parisian-inspired boulevards and the burial of numerous canals that had characterized Bologna and its economy, particularly in silk and paper production since ancient times. This brief introduction to the urban changes of the city is necessary to navigate Bologna in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, during which a relative administrative authority of the Senato, which was a city government body, had to constantly interact with the papacy, which maintained a decisive control both in religious and political matters. Bologna was the second city of the Papal State, obviously. On this map, we can identify some key locations that allow us to place several fundamental buildings and institutions, both civic and religious, that are central to the city's cultural history, particularly its musical history. These buildings and institutions, although not all directly connected to Torelli's biography, explain Bologna's attractiveness to musicians and composers active in central and northern Italy. In our map, we can position the three active theaters in Bologna during Torelli's time. The first, in order of foundation, is the theater located in the Palazzo del Podestà, Palazzo Rienzo, here indicated with the letter S for Sala, as it was commonly called. This space, created in the 16th century to host the comedies of the Istrioni, as well as ball games and acrobats, originally consisted of temporary structures, just as the ones that hosted the annual Festa della Porchetta in August, which took place near the Teatro della Sala, outdoors in front of San Petronio. The feast was a medieval tradition where the population met under the Palazzo Comunale to participate in the throwing of the porchetta, accompanied by musicians, as you can see both in the title page of the Vera Storia della Piacevolissima Festa della Porchetta by Giulio Cesare Croci of 1599 and the Scenario of 1680. These iconographic sources, combined with descriptions of the feast, are essential for understanding a city soundscape that was not limited to closed spaces, but also, logically, to the squares and streets. In the 1632 apparatus for the feast, here drawn by Andrea Segizzi, who was later involved in the design of other important city theaters, the placement of the festival structures is clearly visible, as is at the location of the Sala in the Palazzo del Podestà with its balcony in front of San Petronio, Sala del Palazzo. It is the Sala which was renovated several times in the first half of the 17th century to keep up with innovations in theatrical space. From the mid-century onward, it became a landmark in the public entertainment market. Owned by the Bolognese Senato, the Sala was entrusted to impresarios who use it for opera performances, but also for comedies and puppet shows. As a theater, it remained active until 1767. The second theater of great importance, in competition with the one in the Sala, was the Teatro Formagliari, the hall owned by the family, which became a theater at the end of the 1630s to support the activities of the Accademia dei Riaccesi under the patronage of Senator Filippo Guastavillani. Designed in Venetian style by Andrea Segizzi, the theater, according to Felsina Pittrice by Carlo Cesare Malvasia, served as a standard and model for all others, even outside Bologna. The Formagliari, which after 1770 passed to the Zagnoni family, was completely destroyed by a fire in 1802. The third theater in order of construction was the Malvezzi, built in the Equestrian Hall of the eponymous family, also designed by Segizzi. Unlike the two previously mentioned theaters, the Malvezzi was settled up following a public competition for its construction. After the failure of the competition in 1680, it was later built and opened during Carnival in 1686. Here you can see the 1680 notice with describing the theater with 4 orders of 16 boxes each, made of stone, each capable of holding 6 people. Artistically managed by the will of Malvezzi by Giacomo Antonio Perti, over the years the theater was enlarged and decorated. Its activity ceased in 1745 when it was destroyed by a fire. The new Teatro Pubblico, now the Teatro Comunale, was built precisely in response to the loss of this important city entertainment venue. The presence of 3 theaters, to which the Teatro Marsigli Rossi in Strada Maggiore would be added in 1710, made Bologna a theatrical hub with a musical activity that, however, remained somewhat discontinuous. In fact, the prohibition of the papal legates, the restriction imposed during the Jubilee years, political and economic crisis, news of war, and measures to curb the plague limited regular activity. On the contrary, a certain continuity can be seen in the palaces of the local nobility, still too little studied, which, being obviously subject to fewer restrictions than public theaters, constantly hosted entertainments, operas, and oratorios. Limiting myself to quoting the noble palaces mentioned in the librettos, I recall those of Albergati, Bentivogli, Bevilacqua, Bolognini, Bovi, Campeggi, Fantuzzi, Pepoli, Ranuzzi, Sampieri, Orsi, and Zoppio, which I have attempted to locate on the map. In the context of oratorios, libretto tells us of a wide diffusion in churches and the nexus of arch-confraternities, confraternities, companies, congregation, and churches. Between them, the most active was the congregation of San Filippo Neri with the oratorio of Santa Maria in Galliera, and the congregation of San Gabriele, whose oratorio in the 19th century became a rather poor theater. Oratorios were also performed in the palaces of Caprara, Desideri, Malvasia, Mattesillani, Paleotti, Pepoli, Spada, as well as in the main chapel of Palazzo Pubblico and in the Sala della Musica of San Petronio, that was in the apartment of the Maestro di Cappella. It is also appropriate to mention the constant activity of musical chapels of the Cathedral of San Pietro and generally of all the churches in Bologna. To name the major ones, those of San Giovanni in Monte, Santa Lucia, San Domenico, Santo Stefano, San Francesco, Santa Maria dei Servi, Santa Maria della Carità, and of course, the prestigious Basilica of San Petronio. For time reason, I have to overlook a great number of academies. I limit to quote the ones with musical activities, as the Unanimi, predominantly literally, which was destined to cease its activities soon because it was poorly connected to the nobility, the Filomusi, whose records are limited to the 1620s, and of course, the Accademia Filarmonica, founded in 1666. As our map fills with colored points, almost covering the entire fabric of the city within its walls, it is important to remember the role of some key institutions in music education, such as the Jesuit colleges of San Francesco Saverio and San Luigi, known as the colleges of the nobility, as well as the female conservatory of Santa Maria degli Angeli, known as Conservatorio delle Zitelle. In this overview, we cannot overlook the artisan workshops closely connected to music production, specifically those of printers and luthiers. During Torelli's years of activity, Giacomo and Pier Maria Monti, Marino Silvani, and his son Giuseppe Antonio, with a printing shop at the Pavaglione or at the Portico della Morte, and Josefo Micheletti should certainly be mentioned. Among the luthiers, notable figures include Floriano Guidanti and his sons Antonio and Giovanni, with a workshop in the district of Pellicani, and the Tonoli family, Tonoli, with a shop all'Insegna dell'Aquila in the area of Santa Maria dei Celestini, which included Giovanni and his sons Carlo Annibale and Felice. The community of German luthiers active in the district of San Mamolo should also not be forgotten. So far, the famous Basilica of San Petronio has only been mentioned in passing, yet it is obviously a central hub for the city's musical history. I focus on it only to highlight the crisis of the institution itself, which occurred precisely during Torelli's years. Understanding this crisis is crucial for grasping the reasons why many composers moved elsewhere, and in the case of Torelli, the beginning of a career that we would today define as international. Reading the downsizing of the musical chapel of San Petronio exclusively in terms of cultural policy would, however, be reductive. The city of Bologna, as it had experienced a severe famine in the early 17th century, partially due to the plague of 1629-30, went through a significant depression in the mid-17th century, as the rest of Italy did, culminating in another crisis between 1793 and 95. Furthermore, by the end of the 17th century, the decline of the silk industry, partially due to the decision to bury certain canals for the health reason, and consequently close mills, had led to economic hardship, even for the nobility. This situation, certainly not a rosy one, was further aggravated by the War of the Spanish Succession, starting with the death of Charles II of Habsburg in 1700. The concerts involved the entire population, including musicians who entrusted their worries to letters. Despite a large number of places suitable for music performance, we learn of a difficult situation for composers and musicians who lived in the city, as the crisis impacted the number of festive occasions and entertainment, both in the 17th and early years of the 18th century. The number of chapel masters, composers, and performers active in Bologna, often residing there with their families, felt the need to continue working outside the city, or more generally, outside the papal state. The downsizing of musical chapel of San Petronio is, from this perspective, emblematic of the crisis impact on the musical professions. At this point, allow me to step outside the map maze to note how the varied context of the city's patronage may have influenced Torelli's decision to move to Bologna at a young age, and how his training in counterpoint in the city, as well as his particular relationship with Giacomo Antonio Perti, affected his artistic development. To do this, I will refer to the collection of letters related to Perti, which includes documents that are still not particularly well known. Although only 4 letters from the Perti correspondence are directly related to Torelli as a sender, the violinist, as you can see in the index, the abstract of the index, is mentioned throughout the correspondence, testifying his close relationships with distinguished figures in Bologna and abroad, and his integration into the city's fabric. Those aspects explain the reason why he obtained the citizenship in 1705. First of all, the recognition of Torelli's citizenship confirmed his arrival in Bologna in 1684, corresponding with his admission to the Accademia Filarmonica, as also testified by Carlo Antonio Zanatti, who, with Perti, sponsored Torelli's case before the Bolognese Senato in 1705. The issue of citizenship is crucial to understanding the deep relationships between Torelli and his adopted city. Since the 14th century, the granting of Bolognese citizenship to foreigners was linked to participation in the city's defense and tax payments, with restriction on new citizens holding public office. However, from the end of the 16th century onward, common citizenship could be obtained after having lived an vita onesta e civile in Bologna for 25 consecutive years with a house in one's name. The condition for losing citizenship was being absent for 3 years. Torelli evidently met the required criteria, as evidenced also by his significant teaching activity carried out over the years in Bologna. Torelli's main contact in Bologna revolved around Francesco Antonio Pistocchi and Giacomo Antonio Perti. The three were bound not only by friendships, but also by professional relationships and training. While Pistocchi received qualche direzione from Perti, those are Perti's words, Torelli was his pupil di pianta, evidently in counterpoint. Given Torelli's position in the Cathedral of Verona, it is likely that his move to Bologna was due to Perti's presence there. At the time, Perti was the maestro di cappella at the Cathedral of San Pietro and had been recognized as established master of counterpoints since 1681. From Bologna, Perti played an important role in spreading Torelli's reputation beyond the city. A letter from December 1687 reveals that Perti sent 3 of Torelli's symphonies to his esteemed teacher Giuseppe Corso Celano in Parma. Celano appreciated them and also took copies of 2 of them, quella in D la Sol Re con terza maggiore e l'altra in G Sol Re ut, before sending the score back to Bologna. In 1688, Torelli, having just published the splendid Opus 4, with engravings by Carlo Antonio Buffagnotti, presented it to the dedicatee Francesco II of Este. Perti, from Bologna, recommending that Giovanni Battista Giardini, the Duke's secretary, admit his student to meet the Duke. Torelli's compositional and performance skills were also praised by the bass singer Lorenzo Gaggiotti, who, writing to Perti from Vienna in October 1686, greets Torelli. In praising the musicians in Vienna, Gaggiotti indirectly reveals a particular feature in Torelli, namely his cantabile playing style. The letter hints at Torelli's ongoing studies with Perti, showing that the maestro had written to his friend in Vienna praising his young pupil. Torelli's admission to the prestigious Accademia Filarmonica and later his joining the San Petronio musical ensemble under Giovanni Paolo Colonna's directorship testify to Torelli's deep connection with the city's leading musical institutions, where he remained until the downsizing of the chapel in February 1696, following Colonna's death and before Perti's appointment. That's why in 1696 many musicians from the chapel, including Pistocchi and Torelli, left, and several, as Fagnani, changed professions. As for Torelli and Pistocchi, their dismissal from San Petronio led to several travels. In Venice in 1696, the two met Georg Frederick II of Brandenburg, from whom they began working, and they traveled to Berlin and Amsterdam. From Vienna, Torelli shared news of his performances at the court and mentioned his intention to make a pilgrimage to Loreto, as well as to San Marino to drink the healing waters. In the letters, we learn about the maledetta ipocondria e melanconia that tormented him. Despite his stay abroad, his trips to Turin and Venice between 1698 and 99, and his time in Ansbach and Vienna at the court of Leopold I of Habsburg, Torelli's connection to his adopted city remains strong, and it must be if he wishes to attain citizenship. From Vienna, he writes that he wishes to return to Bologna. A leave is granted in February 1701. At the time, the San Petronio Musical Chapel was reinstated, with Torelli taking the lead of the orchestra. At the beginning of the 18th century, few correspondents, mainly from the Medici court, sent their regards to Torelli, whose return from Austria was evidently awaited. From this point on, Torelli's travel would always start from Bologna and were likely always uncomfortable in order to save money, such as trips to Genoa in 1701 or 2. A habit of saving which Pistocchi humorously note. Where is it? Number 385? Yeah, that one. In tale errore, Giuseppe sia arrivato, vuole avere, se Dio non l'aiuta, un viaggio disastroso assai, solo per sparagnare una dobla o due. Me ne spiace all'anima, ma in tale errore non è più in stato di ricevere correzione da nessuno, da niuno. While in Bologna, Torelli was constantly invited to send his music elsewhere. In 1703, Pistocchi asks him to reply to his letter and send 2 sonatas with trumpet and the opus 6, the Concerti musicali, of 1698 to serve a gentleman in Florence. Okay. Even while Torelli was in his deathbed, Aurora Sanseverino requests through Perti some of his recent solo violin sonata to be sent in Naples. The condolences that arrived to Perti upon Torelli's death demonstrate, if further proof were needed, the intense relationship between the two. In conclusion, I will take just a few seconds to share with you some human aspects that emerge from the correspondence. Beyond frugality, this concerned the modesty and irony of Torelli. In a letter from Pistocchi in Vienna in May 1700, we learned that Torelli did not accept a gift of a necklace from Leopold I because non ha ardito di domandarla. Pistocchi wrote, io l'ho sgridato e gli dico roba del diavolo, ma lui dice che non se ne cura e che è contento. Again, in 1702, from Ottavio Felice Mainero, we learned that Torelli decided not to present Perti's credential in Genoa, and that had he done so, he would have certainly achieved more. As for the ironia, I like to remember the letter written by Pistocchi in 1703, where the singer recalled the ridiculous figure of the organist Federico Meccoli, active in Patolino, imagining the laughter his friend Torelli will have upon reading his colorful description. On this occasion, he reminds us of our violinist laughing to the point of breaking a candle while listening to Pistocchi reading the dialogue of the Banzola by Lotto Lotti in Bolognese dialect. And if knowing the language of an area in which one lives is the foundation of integration, I would have no trouble defining Torelli as truly Bolognese. Thank you. Gelato.
Thank you very much, Giulia, for this really rich overview of many things, actually, which were going on in Bologna at that time. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions. We are very good in time. So who would like to comment or to add or to ask something? Mark.
Thank you for this very complete overview of musical institutions in Bologna. You didn't miss one, so this is great. But what happened to his cittadinanza? Did he lose it upon being in Ansbach? Or
No. Probably he stayed in Ansbach in Vienna, not for 3 years consecutively.
He come back then?
He came
Bologna?
back several times, probably, to maintain the necessary for obtain the citizenship after 25 years. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So did you find any evidence of his return to Bologna in that period in his letters?
The particularity is that there are a lot of letters by Pistocchi, because Pistocchi was constantly in travel. But Torelli was in Bologna a lot of time in the 25 years. So he usually have the necessity to write to Perti. But we can find inside Pistocchi's letters to Perti a lot of greetings to Torelli that is here in Bologna with you. Torelli, Giuseppe, and the brother Felice were together in Bologna. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. A very tiny question. In letter number 33, you showed us there's a Fagotino mentioned. We had just had a research project at the Schola on Fagotini, the small. Okay, this is my question. It was too fast.
No, it's a bag. Yeah. Infatti stavo cercando uno strumento. No, it's a bag, a fagotto, no? Filled with
Déformation professionnelle.
Yeah. It was really a practice to send music abroad, make copy, and return the original one in the city. That's why San Petronio is really full of music for us. So letters are published in open access, so you can freely look at them.
The letters are very interesting.
Yeah.
Many more questions? No, maybe I would like to ask you, we connect, of course, Torelli to San Petronio, but maybe you could maybe say a couple of words about his other activities with Perti in this theater or this other, maybe if you have a couple of minutes or if you like, just to have more insight in this.
I've got one. Probably when Perti was the artistic director of the Formagliari, the collaboration between the two was really, really strong. Actually, there are some, only one essay, I think, or one another in preparation by Francesco Lora about the presence of symphonies by Torelli in Perti's operas. This is a new news, but he is working about it. There are symphonies in San Petronio's archive, probably linked with operas by Perti in Formagliari. That's probably why in 1721, if I remember well, the Accademia Filarmonica started with a new class, not only composers, generally speaking, but composers of instrumental music. It's another class added in the Accademia Filarmonica in the 20s, I think. Probably because of activity of Torelli. There are no documents about it.
Thank you.
Federico
Lanzellotti.
Thank you very much, Giulia. It is very interesting, this relationship with Aurora Sanseverino. Have you found more information about this connection with Naples?
Yeah, Torelli and Pistocchi, with all the chapel of San Petronio, went to Piedimonte Matese in 1703, if I remember well, to visit Aurora Sanseverino, to play serenatas, the Handel famous one, and the others by Perti. So the entire chapel of San Petronio went to Piedimonte Matese. From that point, from 1703, Aurora Sanseverino constantly greets Torelli and Pistocchi in the letters directed to Perti, as well as Giulio Cavalletti, who was obviously an important singer at the Sanseverino court, starting writing them from that point, from 1703.
Great, thank you.
Enrico Gatti.
About Aurora Sanseverino, I think she was one of the sponsors of Giuseppe Avitano in Naples. Avitano published one sonata called L'Aurora, dedicated to her.
Probably, yes, there are cantatas, L'Aurora by Perti, dedicated to her, yeah. Her, and not the husband. The husband was not so musically... Yeah.
Thank you very much, Julia, again.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we have time. Yeah. Enrico, you can show, puoi già sistemare. Enrico Gatti is professor of historical violin at the Royal Conservatoire in The Hague and holds the chair of Baroque violin at the Conservatorio of Bologna. His international activity is divided between concert and teaching, and as always, accompanied by a great passion for research. So Enrico is, has published many articles about topics related to the violin and violin repertoire. Yes, maybe he was the very first Italian to deal with Baroque violin, or more or less, I think so. And having studied with Chiara Banchini, who is well known here on the Schola, she was our teacher many years. He is winner of numerous recording awards, and I like to recall his last CD, Preconium Solitudinis, which has been described as a new paradigm of musical utopia. It's very beautiful CD. Thank you, Enrico, for being here, and we will have the time. His topic is, can you see, is about the multi-chordal practice on the violin in Italy, and also by Torelli, of course. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Agnese. Thank you very much for this invitation and presentation. The discussion concerning multi-chordal practice on the violin in the 17th century is a rather ambiguous field for various reasons that make the practice of that period quite distant from us and often obscure. Among those who have addressed this topic in the past are Peter Alsop, Constance Frei, and Piotr Wilk. And I'm very happy to see Constance and Piotr here today. In this field, there has perhaps long been a prejudice against Italian violinist composers. Even today, the fascination and myth of German and Austrian violinist composers as the true pioneers of polyphonic writing for the violin remains strong in contrast to their Italian counterparts, who allegedly preferred a more monodic style. I believe this prejudice can be traced back to the idea expressed by Dora Julia Iselin, which was later reaffirmed by the authoritative David Boyden. The inspiration for writing double stops and chords came to Marini while he was in Germany under the influence of local violinists. And Boyden, like Farina, who served as concertmaster in Schütz in Dresden, Marini learned from the German style, especially in the matter of double stops. It is unclear, no one has ever demonstrated what these supposed examples of polyphonic writing from the German school at the beginning of the 17th century might be, as they, in fact, do not exist. On the contrary, during this period, there were numerous Italian musicians active in foreign courts and chapels, making it far more logical to assume the opposite, that the influence originated from Italian virtuosos. The first published instances of double stops are indeed those by Biagio Marini from Brescia, and Carlo Farina from Mantua. Marini was able to incorporate various double stops passages in his Opus 2, published in 1618, and Opus 8, published in 1629, which, among other things, bore the subtitle Alcune sonate capricciose per suonare 2 e 3 parti con il violino solo, con altre curiose e moderne invenzioni. It is interesting to know that Farina also had the following written on the title page of his secondo libro. Inventions of this kind have never before been seen in print. This could suggest that such musical elements were not commonly found in published works, but were frequently heard in the performances of Italian virtuosos. There was another violinist composer from the same period who managed to publish at least one work featuring polyphonic writing, Ottavio Maria Grandi, active between 1610 and 1630, but not in Germany. He was a product of the Bolognese school and a member of the musical chapel of the Basilica of San Petronio. Various scholars have noted Grandi's use of double stops, and the key passage was transcribed over a century ago by Gustav Beckmann, even if some inaccuracies. I'll now present my reconstruction of the final section of Grandi's sonata using the manuscript preserved in Berlin in the Staatsbibliothek. It's a manuscript copied by the violinist Johann Georg Beck around 1630 for the violin part, and the original print preserved in Bologna, Museo Internazionale Biblioteca della Musica, for the bass part. And this is my transcription of the last part of the sonata by Ottavio Maria Grandi. Here we are faced with a writing style very similar to that of Biagio Marini, and even the printer is the same, Bartolomeo Magni, Stampa del Gardano. Carlo Farina had used a complex system to indicate the second note to be played simultaneously with the first by printing a number that indicated the interval between the sounds. In the case of the Capriccio Stravagante, very well known, however, some double stops were added by hand on the movable type print, and this expedient was later used to supplement 17th century musical prints of works by Girolamo Frescobaldi, Bartolomeo Montalbano, even in Germany, Philipp Friedrich Bödecker, and even the beginning of the 18th century in Giorgio Gentili's Capricci da Camera. Evidently, these were exceptional cases, and it was certainly not possible to play in prints based on unwritten additions. It is interesting to see what Bartolomeo Grassi reported when speaking about Frescobaldi. He informs us that Mr. Girolamo has produced countless other volumes and is continuously creating more, but the effort and cost of printing do not allow them to be published. 80 years later, things in Italy still did not seem to have changed when Giuseppe Valentini, in the preface to his Idee per camera, violino, violone, cimbalo, published in Rome, 1706, 1707, stated that he could not publish the second part, the sonatas for 2 and 3 strings, due to the enormous expense it would have entailed. And yet, unfortunately, this announced the second part for 2 and 3 strings would never see the light of print. On the other hand, even before the mid-17th century, Italian violin literature shows us that instrumental technique in relation to the possibilities of printing had developed significantly more. This is a list of all the special effects used by the Italian violin players in 17th century. But most probably, anyway, the best Italian violinists prioritized other values in their style rather than special effects. Now, the document I will show now has already been quoted by Giulia Giovani just before, a letter written by Lorenzo Gaggiotti, who lived in Vienna, to Giacomo Antonio Perti, who was teacher and friend of Torelli. This letter reads as follows: I am glad that Torelli brings honor to himself through his studies, and I thank him for his greetings. Tell him that here there is a great number of musicians and good ones, but the cantabile style is unknown. In any case, the prejudice I mentioned earlier seems to be a retrospective assumption influenced by the extraordinary violin writing of Johann Sebastian Bach and the earlier collection of Bieber, Westhoff, and Walter, all of which exist in manuscript sources or more commonly were engraved on copper plates. However, I'm not interested in establishing a priority or asserting supremacy of Italian violinists. I do not think it is necessary to debate whether the chicken or the egg came first. To me, it seems that in every country where the violin was widespread, virtuosos of the instrument naturally practiced the double stops as an essential part of a musical language embedded in the genetic heritage of the music of the time. This is, as an example, this is a fantasia composed by Etienne Nau, who was a French violinist, and this was probably composed between 1613 and 1619. This is also in the Berlin manuscript. Throughout the 17th century, various musicians raised their voices in protest against the limitations imposed by the movable type printing techniques of the time, complaining about the impossibility of fully notating their musical compositions. Among these, we could mention, for example, Giovanni Antonio Bertoli, who was a bassoon virtuoso, the German printers of Rosenmüller sonatas, and Giovanni Maria Bononcini. The latter one clearly states that double stops are normally written in the manuscripts, thus confirming an established practice. In various musicological texts, it has been noted that after the polyphonic beginnings of Marini, Grandi, and Farina, there was a gap in Italy regarding multi-chordal writing. After the devastating plague epidemic between 1629 and 1633, which claimed more than a quarter of the population, many lands and cultivated fields were abandoned. Major cities suffered from a lack of labor, leading to a crisis in various sectors. Publishing activity diminished almost everywhere due to the severe economic downturn and the rising cost of wood and paper. This phenomenon helps explain why in the mid-17th century we do not see as many publications as in the earlier decades. The music publishing industry later flourished again, and there will also be new compositions with polyphonic writing for violin in Italy. Now, let us try to determine how many and which sources exist for Italian violin music with multi-chordal writing. I apologize in advance for any omissions or shortcomings. This table does not claim to be exhaustive and remains open to any of your suggestions. You can see on the left the name of the composers, and then the area of the activity, the year when the music was composed or published, then the kind of source, if movable types, manuscripts, or engravings, then the key in which the pieces are written, and then if the writing is chordal harmonic or rather contrapuntal polyphonic, and then if there are 3-part chords or 4-part chords. Italian composers are listed in black, while I have marked the most authoritative sources from the Austro-German area in red, following a chronological order as much as possible. And this is the second part. As can be observed, after the period of crisis, multi-chordal compositions appear almost exclusively in manuscript sources or engravings. However, it is my opinion that we tend to judge solely based on what has survived to this day. But I believe this represents only a small portion, a fragment of what could be described as a broken mirror. For example, just to give an example, how can we claim to know the word of the pre-Corellian sonatas in Rome when we have only one sonata for violin basso continuo by Carlo Mannelli, who was the principal violin player when Torelli came to Rome. Yet we know that upon his death, Carlo Mannelli left behind as many as 86 violin sonatas, 86 sonatas, and we only know one. So therefore, as time and experience have shaped my understanding, I have come to realize that what we don't know, what has not been documented, is vastly greater than what has been preserved. Look a moment what happened on Easter Island, the Isla de Pascua. So you see, the Moai are not just heads, but there is much more. Now, I will take you for a very brief moment into the heart of the early 17th century on an ordinary day. On May 29, 1621, Donna Giulia Felice d'Este, an Augustinian nun at the monastery of San Gimignano in Modena, wrote to her father as follows: I heard Cavalcabò play, and it seems to me that he plays very well. I know that your most illustrious lordship has heard him, as he told me, and I can believe that you did not dislike him. He is staying in Modena for 4 or 5 days, and during this time I want to improve a little more by having him show me the style and technique. On the very first day, I already learned a double trill while playing on 2 strings, which is, however, very difficult to execute. He praised my violin greatly, saying that it comes from the finest hands of Cremona. Antonio Girolamo Amati. So what Giulia Felice calls groppo doppio could be illustrated with an example like this, which was printed only at the beginning of the 17th through a beautiful engravings on copper plates. Evidently, the practice was much older, as it was learned by a nun who, although a skilled musician, did not make a living from her musical activity, unlike Cavalcabò, who was a professional. Giulia Felice d'Este's testimony clearly informs us that playing on double stops was already a completely normal practice in Italy at the beginning of the 17th century, even before the sonatas of Ottavio Maria Grandi and Biagio Merini were printed. Giulia Felice, in addition to studying singing, organ, and chitarrone, also dedicated herself to the violin. Among the teachers who were permitted to give lessons to the nuns was Don Marco Uccellini. As Giulia Felice described him, he was a person worthy of all good, both for his virtues and for being a priest of exemplary life. She supported him on several occasions. So, as we have seen, it was normal for an Italian violinist in 1720 to perform a trill in thirds. Here, however, is Gustav Beckmann speaking about the works of Johann Jakob Walter. In any case, the trill in thirds, which we encounter on several occasions, Scherzi, Musicali, and Ottolus Caelicus, is an unheard of fingering for his time. Thank you. So the German-speaking musicology has long given us a distorted view of reality, entirely focused on the copper engravings or manuscripts of the late 16th and early 17th by 4 composers, Bieber, Walter, Westhoff, and Bach. In my opinion, a more objective examination of the existing documents could lead us to a different and more realistic perception of the performance practice of that period. There are various violin compositions by Torelli in which multi-chordal writing appears. This writing can have either a contrapuntal polyphonic character or harmonic chordal one. In a collection engraved by Carlo Buffagnotti, dating to around 1700, 3 out of 7 sonatas, including that of Torelli, feature multi-chordal writing. The engraver used the etching technique acquaforte. Torelli's piece includes sequences of thirds and sixths, as well as peculiar chords in which the notes are struck 2 by 2. As you can see the red arrows. This distinctive type of double stop arpeggio, which begins with the highest note rather than from the bass, is a unique characteristic of Torelli. This technique was later revisited in the 12th concerto of Opus 8, albeit with the arpeggio inverted, starting this time from the lower notes. In Opus 4, published in 1690 by Silvani and engraved by Buffagnotti using his customary techniques, the engraver's eccentric genius is evident, more than his skill in reproducing musical notation, which in any case is interesting due to its polyphonical texture. This collection, however, was clearly intended for a high-ranking noble who played solely for leisure. Consequently, the polyphonic writing is designed in such a way as to allow even a not-professional musician to perform it pleasantly while using it as a means of practice. However, Buffagnotti did not use the burin, but rather the etching technique, acquaforte, in which the acid sometimes creates impurities on the copper plates, and in the case of music, makes it less clear. This can be considered another reason, beside the significant cost of engravings, why they were quite rare in Italy. More noteworthy is an engraving, also by Buffagnotti, preserved at the Biblioteca Estense in Modena, which features a jig a staccato by Torelli. In this piece, the dense polyphonic structure, enriched with triple stops, closely resembles the styles of Walter and Westhoff. In Torelli's writing, there is a recurring element that leads to a polyphonic idea, the technique of arpeggio on three-note chords, tricordi. In this technique, the fingers of the left hand are positioned and then simultaneously on the strings, as if the notes were being played at the same time. Torelli made extensive use of this device also in his concertos. For example, in this concertino for 4 violins composed to be inserted into a sinfonia with trumpets. In these cases, most probably a large arpeggio was used, but in the case of this aria with obbligato violin, it is certainly an arpeggio battuto, which is detached on 3 or 2 strings. This aria was composed for one of Perti's operas. In the sonata for 2 obbligato instruments, violin and cello with basso continuo, which Torelli wrote, and it's among the pieces copied by Georg Pisendel in Dresden, we can instead observe a writing style similar to that of the last Assisi sonata attributed to Arcangelo Corelli. So you can see on the top a fragment of the 12th sonata, the 12th Assisi sonata by Corelli, and then 2 fragments of the Torelli sonata for violin, cello, and continuo, with a series of prepared dissonances, followed by their resolution requiring frequent shifting. In the concertos Opus 8, published posthumously by his brother Felice Torelli in 1709, we do not find significant innovations, as they were printed using movable type. Despite the printer's Marino Silvani efforts to include various 2- and 3-voice chords, the polyphonic language in Opus 8 remains largely confined to different types of arpeggios, both struck and slurred. The most important multi-chordal piece in Torelli's known works is the sonata in E minor for violin and basso continuo. This sonata, whose manuscript source is likely very close to the composer, reveals how Torelli's writing could easily embrace polyphony in a wide variety of ways. In the first movement, we have a chordal writing with spiccato bowing. In the second movement, largo ma spiritoso, the chords are presented in the form of arpeggiated 16 notes. We find 3rd and 5th chords with intermediate passing notes, followed by a series of 7 chords. The movement concludes with an interesting toccata in an imitative dialogue with the bass, where another variation of polyphonic language appears, the bariolage, which would later be frequently employed by Johann Sebastian Bach. The following movement constitutes the true center of the entire composition. The character of this fugato aligns with the canzona form, distinguished by its characteristic anacoustic dactylic opening. The origins of this form can be traced back to the canzone motet, which represent a fusion of vocal and instrumental stylistic elements. This suggests that each reiterated note ideally corresponds to a different syllable of an implicit text. After this, we have a slow movement in 3/2, characterized by a twisted melodic line that frames a central section composed entirely of 3 chords. It is plausible that this chordal section should also be performed with the spicco bowing technique. The following movement is a perfidia sui generis, as it features a sequence of arpeggios with notes consistently grouped in legato patterns of 4, which is another variant of polyphonic writing. The sonata concludes with a giga, as was customary at the time, evidenced by all of Corelli's works. Dance-like movements within church sonatas were never explicitly labeled with the name of the dance, but rather given simple tempo markings, in this case allegro. Another common practice shared with Corelli is the inclusion of a final movement in dance style using the same thematic material from the preceding fugue for its subject. You can see this is the main fugue, and this is the last movement. What is particularly noteworthy in this is that the fugal jig is not written in 12/8, but in 4, a feature frequently encountered in Bolognese musical literature. So from a technical standpoint, this remarkable sonata surpasses Corelli's writing in terms of its demands in the upper register, as well as its extensive use of 2 and 3 voice chords and many arpeggios. Here, the concept of polyphonic writing permeates the entire composition from beginning to the end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Enrico, for this very interesting presentation. Also, important overview of some key points in the development of this technical reproduction of violin music. Questions, comments, or Giulia Giovani.
I would like to add a line in your table. I remember the vocal duets by Bononcini that were printed once by Pier Maria Monti, I think, and later as a second edition by Marino Silvani, 10 years difference, the first from the second edition. The first one I've got in the continuo part, the manuscript addition to the part, and the Silvani one is really particular as there are, I think, 4 or 5 bars with double chords added with engravings. So he decided to probably to combine. I think technically it's really difficult, no, to combine 2 different kind of technique of printing technique. But so Bononcini duets.
But this is vocal music. Yeah. Yeah, there are. Because my original paper was much larger, and also I was mentioning also the Iacchini cello sonatas in the both versions, the movable type first edition and the Buffagnotti version with double stops, and there are also double stops for cello written by Colombi and other composers. Yeah, thank you.
Constance Frei.
Thank you very much, Enrico. One question about diteggiatura. Do you know something about the diteggiatura and the practice of open chords.
Open strings. you mean?
Open strings, yeah. Do you know something?
The 17th century is not so easy because we get more indication rather in the next century.
Of course.
I think the Bieber sonatas with scordatura are quite useful because you can realize that if you don't play the right fingerings, you don't get the right notes. So I think Amandine can confirm that sometimes you need to make use of shifting just in the first string usually and going back as soon as possible, not staying much in. Yeah. But in the 18th century, for instance, Tartini in some letters says very clearly that our school is we play on the sul manico. So and then very often they were just staying in position. But yeah, 17th century. I don't know if you know sources about 17th century. There are just a few. I think very
rare.
Very rare. But in 18th century we get some.
I thought maybe in the manuscripts it was.
Yeah, in the manuscript.
And find some diteggiatura.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it happens. I think Bartolomeo Bernardi maybe gives some. You can get sometimes few numbers. Also Geminiani opus 1 in the second edition, of course, not in the first.
Other questions? From the students maybe. I would be curious to know, Enrico, which implication has the fact that okay, we don't have, for instance, for the 17th century, many written sources with multi-chordal practice, but if you would like to add.
Yeah, this was a part that I had to cut because it was too long. No, there are several statements that the double stops were used by the master, by maestri. Also, Nicola Matteis is writing this in the preface of his second book, I think. And I think also Roger North is writing about this. And there are several examples, and I think Piotr Wilk has shown us in one of his many articles that, for instance, when he was dealing with comparing Lonati and Colombi manuscript, the manuscripts in Modena, in Biblioteca Stense, some sonatas ascribed to Colombi, which in fact are by Lonati, and I think Colombi was a copyist for the Duke at a certain moment. He was the teacher, and so he was copying sonatas, and there are several versions of sonata. There is the main version with all the full stops, double stops, and then there is another simple version with only one voice, or maybe if the range was going very high, then it was transport 1 octave lower, just for the Duke, because so the possibility of I think also you were investigating the sonatas in English sources, and sometimes they bring this optional double stops. No, like in Matteis. I think this was a normal thing. So there are there is one sonata by Tartini of this very famous manuscript 1888 in Padua, the solo sonata, the piccole sonate. In one case it says, la prima volta si suoni a corda sola, a corda semplice. So the first time you can play just a simple melody, and the second time you can add chords. This was, I think...
it's a good suggestion for...
Yeah, because, I mean, anyway, one of the instruments violin is coming from is the lira da braccio. So the lira da braccio in the 16th century was totally improvised polyphonical practice. So this was in the genetic heritage of musicians, violin and string players. And so improvisation was always a big part of music making, a very important part. So I mean, a composer was not simply a violin player, but a composer used to improvise and used to write a fugue, used to write counterpoint, able to write counterpoint, could be able to add double stops, I think.
Thank you very much, Enrico. So we move on. Thank you again. Our next speaker is Constance Frei. She is professor of musicology at the Faculté de Lettres Université of Lausanne. She also teaches the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, the Humanity and Social Science program of the College of the Humanity, and so on. So she's teaching at many places. She's also a violinist, and her areas of research include the history of performance practice of instrumental music, the history of improvisation, the cultural and material history of the score, intermediality, interaction between music and sciences. And her publication includes articles, book chapter, critical edition, and so on. And one of these books by Constance is dedicated to the art of the violin improvisation in the 17th centuries. So she specialized also in music printing, and we will hear about these topics today related to Torelli. Thank you.
Vivete felici. Okay, no. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Agnese, for the invitation. And it's really very nice to be here with all of you. My talk focuses on aspect relating to musical notation. And I am therefore interested in the score and the representation of music on paper. That means something like hermeneutics. The score is one of the few witnesses to the composer's intentions, so it's important to observe it in details. So what is the soundscape of Bologna during Torelli's life? This was Giulia was talking about earlier. And the acoustic of San Petronio is maybe reflected in Torelli's language. We can maybe reply that the notion of opposing sound masses as a framework for the concerto is a good example of this. So entering in this setting of instrumental music allows us maybe to better grasp the movement of the body, the gesture of the musician, the breathing and the pronunciation of the musical text. So in short, this gateway offers us an opportunity to reflect on the visible part of the sound. So to begin with, Torelli published 8 collections of music. We all know that, just to remember. So from a methodological point of view, our research laboratory was limited to the 4 opuses by Torelli, published by Micheletti. Micheletti is a Bolognese typographer, where, of course, Torelli was active. So these were the first editions of Opus 1, 2, 3, and 5, not the 4th one. And if Torelli wished to continue working with Micheletti after his Opus 1, it must be because he was satisfied with the typographer's work, with whom he was perhaps in close contact since they both lived in Bologna. In addition, there is a fairly intense rhythm between the first three opuses. We have two collections in 1686 and one collection in 1687. And then it would be 5 years before the release of Opus 5 in 1692, which marked the end of Micheletti's activities. So it is really the last book published by Micheletti. So as a result, Torelli was forced to turn to other craftsmen of musical score for his Opus 6, 7, the seventh one is lost, we know that, and the number 8. Thus, half of Torelli's publications were produced by Micheletti. But what happened to Opus 4? Why didn't Torelli entrust his fourth book to Micheletti? The answer is very, very simple, and it is in echo with Enrico Gatti said before about the polyphony and the practice of double stops or triple stops. And in this fourth volume, the use of polyphony, double, triple stops on the violin is at the heart of Torelli's language, so it was therefore necessary to opt for engraving and using a technique a different technique. Movable types are not able to represent multi-stops. Only the Venetian typographer Mani Bartolomeo was mad enough to print polyphony for violin in 1629 with Biagio Marini's Opus 8 we talked before. So Carlo Bufagnotti, the Bolognese scenographer, was commissioned to engrave this Opus 4, allowing us to assert that Micheletti was not equipped to notate polyphony with movable types. Moreover, in the engraving, the slurs do not exceed 2, 3, or 4 notes, so small groups, as in the works printed by Micheletti. So movable types is therefore not a limitation in terms of legato, for example. So coming back to Micheletti, in addition to the works of Torelli, Micheletti specialized mainly in the publication of Bolognese composers. His period of activity spanned 10 years, from 1683 to 1692. So all these information are very useful for us to understand the role of the score. So in his catalog, you haven't read all the 4 volumes of Torelli, but other are very interesting also. I studied all the catalog, so I know how the score is constructed. And I just have one thing to say about it. Yes, the reprint. The reprint is really interesting because it's a testimony of collaboration between Micheletti and other printers in Venezia and Bologna. So this is a special case, but I'm not going to talk about this right now. So its catalog includes 22 editions of music, including 2 reprints from Cazzati and Giovanni Battista degli Antoni, Opus 3, and 1 collection of poetry. Well, just 1 collection without music. All these editions were produced using movable types, no engraving or etching. There was a certain inertia at the start, with 1 volume in 1683, followed by 2 years of silence. Why? It's a question. I don't know how to explain this. So in 10 years, 2 years are mute years, silence years. Then 3 fast years with 4 annual publications. Finally, there was a decrescendo until 1692. So Micheletti's typography workshop was in the heart of the city of Bologna, Piazza del Pavaglione, a strategic location for the sale of his scores, right next to San Petronio, where Torelli had been working since 1686. the year of the two first opuses. So he was violinist, as we said before. Even if Torelli was already at the Accademia Filarmonica 2 years before, so in 84, sorry. So coming back to Micheletti, 3 years after his last publication in 95, Micheletti put his printing equipment up for sale for personal reasons, da vendersi spontaneamente per sé e per ragione propria. And here, of course, I am referring to the paper of Giulia Giovani, fundamental in this era. So Micheletti died in 1698, shortly after his wedding, and an inventory of his possessions drawn up on the 1st December of 1698 suggests that Micheletti was probably also a musician. So a printer musician, it's really interesting for us. Huh? Since he owned a harpsichord, maybe it was his wife harpsichord, I don't know. But we have to keep this in mind. So this is of special interest for us. A typographer enlightened in matters of instrumental practice certainly took a special care with his editions. So Torelli could also have called on other Bolognese printers, such as, well, Buffagnotti is not using movable types, he's engraving, but Caldani, also Cazzati published, it's a long story, but also Cazzati had some a printing workshop. And gli eredi di Dozza, Fagnani, but Fagnani was active a little bit later. Pisarri, Silvani, of course. Why Silvani is not in dialogue with Torelli? It's a good question. Or Pier Maria Monti. It's a good question. No, Torelli is only working with Micheletti. That's all. Even if Silvani and Monti were the stars in this period. So maybe it's because the quality of Micheletti's print or work. This is the question. In the 4 collections of Torelli's music by Micheletti, we have concentrated our attention on the following points. Of course, this is a summary, but in terms of symbols and language, we have spiccato, we have legato, portato, in the writings, no symbols, only the words on the score. And come sta, maybe come sta is interesting to link with the practice of improvisation, come sta, to indicate, to play as it is written and not adding something on the text, the written text. For ornaments, it's trillo, only trillo, and some dynamics indication. That's all. It's a short summary in terms of notation. And to understand the context, the repertoire contained in these 4 opuses is as follows: dances, sonatas, sinfonia, and concerti. Maybe in the dance repertoire we have less symbols and less indication. So the aim of all this is to identify useful information for interpreting and defining Torelli's style. It is worth noting that the spiccato articulation seems to be a feature of Torelli's language, as it is of many composers from Bologna and Modena since 1685. The first printed book with the indication of spiccato is from Bononcini Opera 2, opus number 2, printed by Monti in Bologna. So it's really a specific language. It's like a dialectal form of pronouncing the musical text. So it's really linked. Spiccato is linked with with Bologna and Modena. But I wonder if there is a difference between spiccato and spicco. We don't know exactly, Enrico. Maybe you have an answer, because we find both indication. Maybe it's just a synonym. Maybe it's dealing with a difference. I don't know. In terms of articulation, we have, of course, some indications about legato. It's not really a mad language about legato. We have few indications of slurs on small groups, 2, 3, or 4 groups. So it's not really amazing discover to observe the slurs in the scores. So legato is the main indication we find in the score with spiccato. No dots, no vertical lines or horizontal lines, nothing about the staccato, only spiccato. So, generally speaking, Micheletti's work is meticulous, and his editions are highly regarded by historians. He makes corrections on the score using collette, for example, in Opus 1. So, what is a collect? It's he prints his corrections on other sheet of music, cuts it out to the corrected part and stick it on the page, just to hide the mistake. So this is a very careful way to go back to the right form of the music. So it's really a demonstration of a meticulous process. But we can observe so many different attitudes from Micheletti. It should be remembered that Micheletti workshop do not contain the characters for polyphony, that's sure. That's why number 4 is published by, is engraved by Buffagnotti, as said before. And he did not use symbols such as dots above the notes for staccato. Even the first use of dots is from 1660. He did not use vertical lines, as I said before, because vertical lines, we find vertical lines for staccato since 1682. So 86 would be a good moment for using these articulation symbols. The horizontal line is used only after from 1695 in the score, so it's a little bit earlier, so he's excused. But staccato, or more precisely stoccato, as you can see, he used the term. In the manuscript we find stoccato and not staccato. Tocco, stocco, boh. Oh, it's a mistake. It's a manuscript, it's not an autograph. So stoccato, stocco is, and polyphony are in these manuscripts, and not in the printing shop of Micheletti. Each time we find some polyphonic passages, then it's out of the workshop of Micheletti. So it's really logical. So we have few things that appears in the manuscripts. We can find some dots for staccato. That means maybe Micheletti is not able to, or is not. He has no time to put the dots on the notes. I check in the whole catalog, and I found that he's able to use some dots on the notes. So if in Torelli's language there is no dots, it's because Torelli didn't want the dots, because Micheletti was able, of course, to put some dots. So in the manuscripts we find a little bit more than in the printing books, but it's not a huge difference. So I was a little bit scared about my research, because I said, okay, I was a neat idea before, and the demonstration was a little bit different. So if we go to the technical limitations, we know that Micheletti wrote some slurs by hand. That means when he was completing a few books together in the same year, maybe he was not able to have, he didn't have enough movable types for all the books together. So sometimes we find some slurs by hand, handwritten. Maybe it's a musician after the publication, and a musician's playing on the score, and he add the slurs. It's a possibility. We don't know exactly. But we have also different observations about the 30-second notes that are missing in the scores, in the print shop. So he add some, he modified the 16ths in 30-second notes. So that's why we know that the printer was on the score, writing directly on the paper, on the score, correcting the score. This is of big importance for our research. And about the layout, Micheletti does not always attach the utmost importance to page layout. The examples below show the situations where the piece ends with a single note at the beginning of the line, a sign of wasted paper and a lack of attention to the musician's comfort when reading the score. So you have one note at the beginning of the line. It's really not comfortable. So this is the way Micheletti is working. Another example here, and you find a whole line empty with one note at the beginning. It's completely absurd. I mean, it's not the attitude of the other printers to do so, because paper is very expensive, so usually we don't find these characteristics. And it's like a non-musician doing this kind of layout. If we explore Micheletti's work beyond the works of Torelli, we realize that the problems are widespread and indicate a sloppy layout. Here in this example, taken from a work by Carlo Andrea Mazzolini, Bolognese, we see that certain pieces begin on a line at the end of the page, forcing the reader to make a longer and less comfortable visual movement, not to mention the fact that Micheletti had every opportunity to place the beginning of the piece on the start of the next page, since there are two empty lines at the end of the page. So, technical problems are about the weight on the page. We need to put some information, some movable types in the extreme part of the page when the press is going on the paper to avoid some holes on the paper. That's why maybe he checked, and it's a good repartition on the paper. That's maybe the reason, if there is a reason. If we look at this example, here it's in Giovanni Battista degli Antoni. We see that a musician adds the last part of the music because he need to turn the page, and that was not comfortable. So handwriting on the page. So it seems like this layout, this job, is not the work of a musician, because a musician never do that. it's impossible. And in addition, the off-staff passages are not always carefully completed, which indicates that the work was not always very meticulous. You see some empty spaces, and the attention is really there. The details are not in a good shape. So this is some few points we can find. So in short, we were interested in the way Torelli notated his music, what symbols or graphic features did he use to indicate the pronunciation of his text. He uses 3 types of articulation: spiccato, legato, and portato. A survey of opus 4 engraved by Buffagnotti revealed nothing in particular, with the exception of the use of polyphony, which is the reason for engraving, and the proof of the technical limitations of movable types. In the few manuscripts consulted, on the other hand, we have noted that the use of staccato or stoccato, written with dots on quarter notes. This is perhaps an argument that would allow us to say that Micheletti had to sacrifice part of the content of Torelli's score for practical reasons. He undoubtedly has technical or practical limitations, such as the absence of certain characters, like the 30-second notes. So Torelli's language is simple: no flying staccato, dots on the slurs, no variety in the staccato, and only few symbols. What symbols or graphic features did he use for ornaments? Only the trillo. There are no bow tremolos, no groppi. It's a little bit late for groppi, but no groppi written or indicated by symbols. No messe di voce in his writing. For dynamics, only sometimes forte piano. It's quite the norm in this period, so nothing amazing. And few rare indication of dots in the manuscript, so staccato. To support our hypothesis, we also took a few detours in the characteristics of the page layout. This investigation revealed that on one hand, the typographer pays particular attention to the score with the production of collets, and on the other, a lack of care, no respect for page turns, no economy of paper, inaccuracies and rhythmic errors with the 16ths and the crotchets and so on. Sometimes no key. There are parts with one page, a whole page without key. Well, this is amazing. No addition of extra lines, or even a lack of logic in the grouping of notes on the horizontal axis, just to explain the gesture of the phrase, the musical phrase. So Micheletti certainly doesn't seem to be the most enlightened of typographers, if I may say. He's certainly not an ambassador for Torelli's language, even if Torelli was really satisfied with books published by Micheletti. So our argument about this, his possible abilities as a musician, harpsichordist, at the service of a meticulous typographical work, has not been borne out. To verify our results, it would be necessary to extend the investigation to a larger number of sources. We would need to take reprints of Torelli's work and analyze Micheletti's entire output. I already started, but it's not finished. This work is in progress, and we hope to have new leads to offer on these fascinating questions. But let's not forget that violinistic style of the second half of the 17th century demanded a great deal of freedom on the part of the performer, who improvised on the notated text. It is therefore not surprising to discover that Torelli remains rather vague in the notation and representation of his music. Thank you very much. Voilà.
Thank you very much, Constance Frei. We have time for a couple of questions.
Yes.
Mark?
Thank you, Constance, for elucidating so many things about Micheletti that I've always wondered about too, especially through the degli Antonis. I have actually two questions. There is nothing that Micheletti published before 1683?
Nothing.
Is that the earliest you found?
Yeah,
That's
the first
good to
one,
know.
as we know. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I wonder why Torelli stuck with him. If Micheletti had to sacrifice so much of the music, you mentioned, of course, there is a lot of freedom to be expected from the performer himself, but if he could get all his notes printed by or engraved by Buffagnotti, why didn't he stick to another printer? Do you have any evidence about maybe through letters, maybe of friendships or anything that would explain why Torelli stuck with Micheletti? Was he cheap?
I don't know. Probably it was cheaper than the Monti-Silvani partnership.
Could be.
It could be. Of course, it's cheaper than engraving. This is, of course,
Right.
the first reason. But why no contact with Silvani?
Yeah, who was
It's
also
really-
a violinist in San Petronio.
Yeah,
at some
I don't
point.
know.
Maybe
I
we
can't
should-
explain that.
I would just wondered if there was maybe some letter that would...
And looking at the whole catalogue of Micheletti, it's always the same story. I mean, he's not able to do a real good job. It's not the level of Monti or Silvani.
Or even Cazzati.
Cazzati is the best one, the stranger one, the mad one.
Persecuted one.
Maybe he was his friend, so a friend of him. Yes, this is so logical for me. I would
Maybe some advantage in San
Yes.
Petronio, but what is the point with Micheletti? Before 83, what was the job of Micheletti? Only 10 years with a printing shop. But before, after he died, quite...
How can you say your friend, no, your job is bad? You cannot say, okay.
But he was not leaving from his printing shop. 2 years of silence is the demonstration. He was not eating with this job.
It remains an enigma we have to solve.
It was a passe-temps. It's very chic.
Other questions?
I think that, if I remember well, you mentioned that there was a gap in the years 1684-85. Micheletti was...
Yep.
But I think that Giulia mentioned that there was a plague. And that there was a problem just in those years as well. No,
In general.
Ah, 93,
Yeah,
not
it's
82.
after. No.
Okay.
It's a strange period for the printing shops in Bologna at that time, as Silvani started together with Cazzati, then together with Monti, then with the Filarmonica. Obviously, they worked a lot, but I don't know. It's just an idea. There are several contrasts in that time between Perti, Pistocchi, and Colonna. And so there are some personal dynamics between them that probably influenced that vision or the choices. I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows?
If there is no other question, we can have a break now, coffee break, half an hour, so we until 11:15. And yes, see you later. Thank you again, our speakers for listening. The cafeteria, we have coffee, we can have coffee in the cafeteria there, also just follow me. If you don't know, you can just follow me.
irgendwann sind die Nerven einfach durch. Das nimmt man alles in Kauf, sag ich mal so. Das stimmt. Jetzt muss ich noch kurz noch versuchen.
at the Department of Musicology and Cultural Heritage of Maria Cremona. Since 2020, she has served as research fellow and lecturer at the same department, and she is working on many different topics, but especially her current project revolves around the reception of Italian sacred music in Flanders during the 17th century. But she's also interested in topics related to the violin, and that's why she's here with us. Please, thank you, Valeria. It's a pity that you cannot be with us personally, but we are very grateful and happy that you share your contributions, yes, online.
Thank you, Agnese, and I need to thank you too, and also Birgit to have helped me to prepare this presentation by home. Thank you very much, and thank you too for this invitation. Now I'm trying to share my screen, my presentation, so everybody can you see? Can you see it? I hope so.
Perfect.
Right, so my presentation concerns the Concerti Musicali opus 6. And as all of you know, this collection, this is a collection of 12 concerts for strings, whose characteristics makes them the third most important string music collection for the birth of the instrumental concerto, together with the Concerti Grossi opus 6 by Corelli and the Estro Armonico opus 3 by Vivaldi. Some of the Concerti Musicali anticipate the organization of the solo concerto. Others propose a development of the fortespinus model, as I will talk at the end of this presentation. In many ways, the Concerti Musicali represent an artistic parenthesis in the career of Torelli, who had left Bologna at the time of their composition to become the concertmeister at the court of Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach in Bavaria. In this paper, I will describe the historical context in which the Concerti Musicali were composed and printed, and I will add some few considerations about their forms and general structures. Torelli's move to Germany in early 1696 coincided with the temporary dismissal of the orchestra of San Petrone in Bologna. And we know that between 1696 to 1701, the chapelmeister Giacomo Antonio Perti was forced to summon the orchestra from time to time. Torelli's move was part of an extensive project to recruit Italian musicians promoted by the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach, Georg Friedrich II, this man in the slide, who was a profound admirer of the Italian music culture. And as is well known, the Margrave spent in northern Italy the winter season between October 1695 to the May of the following year. And it's possible that during this time, he firstly met in Venice and hired at the court two singers, Nicola Paris and Francesco Antonio Pistocchi, who was already mentioned today. The project to establish the Ansbach Orchestra was carried out by him, Francesco Antonio Pistocchi, an alto singer. Court accounts show that the ensemble included also other Italians, in fact. The cellist Sonetta, who was paid along with his wife, but we don't know actually what was her role. The organist Rizzetti, who was probably recruited as harpsichord player and for the chamber music, and Pietro Bettinozzi from Bologna, who had been employed earlier during 1695 as violin player and also oboe player. In the internal hierarchical order, Johann Christian Rau was appointed as Kammermusicus, and he was probably obliged also to prepare the liturgical music also. And Francesco Antonio Pistocchi was entrusted with the management of the theatrical performances, and Torelli was appointed as concertmaster. We learn from the Reduction Libelle of 1703 that these roles were maintained until the orchestra was abolished after the Margrave death. So even if Torelli moved to Bologna, he was also in this role. The activity of Pistocchi and the other singers in Ansbach, for example Nicola Paris and Agata Vignali, favored the construction of a court opera house, where Il Narciso, a pastorale in music by Pistocchi and Apostolo Zeno, was performed in March of 1697. It seems that Sophie Charlotte from Brandenburg, the cousin of Georg Friedrich II, attended this play. Torelli's service at the Bavarian court consisted of preparing and performing chamber music concerts, so instrumental music for small and large ensembles, cantatas and arias with voices and instruments. He was also a teacher, and as we know from the biographies of the violinist Pisendel and Johann Hermann Köhler. Teaching was an important means of preparing young members of the court chapel for concert performances. Torelli's activities was quite continuous, because instrumental concerts were given practically all year round, and it was in close contact with all the other musicians, the German musicians, unlike the other Italians. He remained at the court longer than the other Italians, leaving Ansbach for Wien only in 1699. Despite that, it's known that between 1696 and 1697, Torelli's work was interrupted by a trip to Berlin, following Pistocchi. The Concerti musicali opus 6 were composed and printed during his stay at the Ansbach court and probably were perfected in Berlin. The close relationship between the Margrave and the other Italian musicians who left the court as soon as the sovereign was absent suggests that Italians were not particularly integrated into the local musical environment. Even the opera singers, Nicola Paris and Agata Vignali, were allowed to leave the court when the no theater performances were scheduled. It seems, therefore, that there were two distinct groups at the Ansbach court, Italian musicians on one hand and the German musicians on the other. The latter, unlike the former, were also involved in the liturgical music. To confirm the existence of two contrasting instrumental ensembles, it's known that during the absence of the Italians between 1697 and 98, three works in German language by the court composer Christian Ludwig Boxberg were performed in the court opera house. And according to the diary of Johann Baer, who played as first violin in the Weissenfels orchestra, the days before Christmas in 1697, the Italians were replaced by German musicians. Torelli's presence in Berlin at the end of the summer of 1696 is attested by the exchange of letters between the Margrave of Ansbach and his cousin Sophie Charlotte. In a letter dated 14 of August of 1696 and addressed to Sophie Charlotte, the Margrave Georg Friedrich announced the imminent arrival of the renowned singer Pistocchi and Torelli to the court of Sophie Charlotte in Berlin. I added some two translations, English and Italian, of the letter, but I'm sorry, I need to move on. And the response, dated 25th of September of 1696 from Berlin, confirms their presence at the Brandenburg court. The correspondence between the two rulers suggests that the violinist Torelli occupied a subordinate role comparing to Pistocchi, looking for an opportunity to establish his international reputation. Otherwise, Pistocchi must already have been a familiar figure to Sophie Charlotte. She attended a performance of Giuseppe Felicetosi's L'Incoronazione di Circe during the Venetian Carnival in 1690-91, where Pistocchi was engaged. It's evident that the Berlin court aroused great interest because of its modernity and its cultural openness. The arrival in Berlin in 1684 of the young Sophie Charlotte of Hanover as the new electress profoundly transformed the Brandenburg court into a place of patronage of the sciences, arts, and philosophy. The daughter of Ernest August, Prince Elector of Hanover, and Sophie of the Palatinate, She was educated directly by her mother and absorbed her cultural sensitivity, her love of literature, philosophy, and her theological interest. The mother, Sophie of the Palatinate, personally interfered in the management of the cultural circle at the Berlin court, encouraging the exchange of correspondence between the daughter and the philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, formerly at the time librarian and counselor in the court of Hanover. And the mother also sent her lady-in-waiting, Henriette Charlotte von Pöllnitz, to assist in the management of the musical and theatrical events in Berlin, the daughter. No first-hand accounts of Torelli's time in Berlin have survived, but further news of this short trip can be gleaned again from Sophie Charlotte's correspondence with the Margrave of Ansbach. The postscripts of 2 letters are devoted to praising Torelli's skill as a violin player. And I made the 2 letters, I prepared the 2 letters with 2 translations in the same pages. The first letter was dated 30 May 1697, the second June, the 10th of June, the same year. The second letter suggests that in June, Torelli had already left Berlin for Ansbach. So in complex, Torelli lived at Berlin court for about a year, not more. But he had a very good experience, as we can understand. We read from the letter of Sophie Charlotte to the Georg Friedrich. It's relevant that the Concerti Musicali, opus 6, were dedicated properly to Sophie Charlotte. And this is the reason why they are also known as the Brandenburg Concertos. A passage in the dedication letter in red, I circled in red, invites us to believe that the violin performances described in the previous letters referred to the Concerti Musicali and probably to the lost Capricci Musicali, opus 7. Considering the constant demand of new instrumental music required by the Margrave of Ansbach, of whom Torelli was responsible, it's a simple matter to hypothesize that the Concerti a Quattro and the Capricci were already composed during his stay in Ansbach. The first print must have been completed between August and September of 1697, if not earlier. The decision to dedicate the opus 6 to the enlightened ruler Sophie Charlotte of Brandenburg is purely diplomatic, has bearing similarities to the dedication of Francesco Pistocchi's Scherzi Musicali, opus 2, to Frederick III, the husband, the Elector and Margrave of Brandenburg. The early realization of the Concerti Musicali in 1697 is also evident from the cult catalogues of 2 Frankfurt and Leipzig book fairs. The concertos were included in the Autumn Fair edition of 1697, but not in the section of the following publication, Libri in Futuri Pronundinis Prodituri, but in the actual on-selling books, and is also present in the Easter edition of 1698. This means that the volumes already existed and was available for pre-sale in September of 1697. The Concerti Musicali opus 6 were initially printed in Augsburg in 1698 by Lorenz Kroninger and Herz. Kroninger was not used to work on musical notation. Prior to this, Kroninger had only printed in 1696 just one collection of intonation on the Vespers by Franz Xavier Murschauser, Chapelmeister at the Frauenkirche in Munich. It's interesting that in the same year, 1698, the famous publisher Etienne Roger printed a non-authorized version of the Concerti Musicali together with the Lost Capricci Musicali per Camera opus 7. Unlike the former, these were authorized and dedicated to Giacomo Dobry. A third edition of the Concerti Musicali was printed in Venice in 1701 by Giuseppe Sala. This Italian edition lacks the dedication and the letter to the readers, and it appeared on the market when Torelli had already been hired by Giacomo Antonio Perti at the Basilica of San Petronio. The Dutch publishing operation must be interpreted as part of a major project of re-editing of all Torelli's works, which took place in Amsterdam by Roger and even earlier in Antwerp by Hertzens. Roger printed 5 books, one of which was unpublished, the 7th, and this played a significant role in the international circulation of Torelli's music. A comparative analysis of the 3 editions of the music concert, the German, the Dutch, and the Italian, reveals that while they agree in the main content, there is some inconsistency in the positioning of ligatures beneath a small group of notes, but which can be attributed to typographical errors. However, an intriguing variant is observed in the indication of tempo into presto movement of the first and second concertos, respectively. The first edition indicates a C-cut that Roger corrects to a semi-breve sign, considering the former as a graphic error. The C-cut sign appears systematically in all 5 printed parts. Such a systematic choice cannot be considered a typographical error and so included in a critical apparatus, especially considering that the Bavarian printing was personally supervised by Torelli. We must remember anymore that the C-cut alludes to a broader tactus, which generally proceed with a greater agility and rapidity than a semi-breve sign. It's interesting to note that in the Venetian edition, the accompaniment is entrusted to a general basso continuo and not to the organ part as in the Transalpine prints. One may wonder why, not so much for the Venetian choice, but rather for the German one. These musical concerts formed part of the chamber repertoire and could not be performed during religious services. Liturgical music was reserved for the musicians of Protestant confession, while Catholic musicians were excluded. In this context, the organ was probably played by Rau, the Kammer musicus. However, it's important to note that the bass in the Sinfonia 3 Concerto 4 Opus 5 by Torelli also features the organ-cello pair. In this instance, the music did indeed circulate with a paraliturgical context. It's conceivable that Torelli intended to utilize the organ in the Opus 6 to engage the organist Rizzetti, who was also present at court in Ansbach, albeit with an ambiguous role. The simplicity of the title of the Concerti Musicali Opus 6 is indicative. The reference to the concerto form is unique and isolated. There is no reference to the symphonies, and it lacks the allusion to the camera function of the concerto. As it's well known, the terms symphony and concerto often recur in the instrumental literature of the time, suggesting that for a good part of the composers of the time, the 2 terms coexisted, and in many cases they were considered as synonymous. In the treatises Miscellanea Musicale by Angelo Berardi, the author refers that the term symphony is an alternative way of defining the concerto for violins. The titles of many music collections of the time agreed in theory, but in practice they distinguished between concerto and symphony according to their chamber and church functions. Just to say some title of publication of the time too by Torelli, Concerto da Camera per due violini, libro secondo, Concerto per camera violino, libro quarto, and also Giuseppe Bergonzi, Sinfonia da Chiesa, second book, and Francesco Manfredini, Sinfonia da Chiesa. Torelli's Opus 5, published in 1692, deliberately distinguished between symphony for 2 violins and cello concertante on basso continuo, which closely resembles a 3-part church sonata, and the concerto which incorporates the viola part and includes a generic basso part where cello and organ plays together mostly of the time. Formally, the 6 concertos for violins, viola, alto, and basso are preferably, but not always, organized in 3 movements, allegro adagio allegro, thus prefigurating the primary structure of the concerto ritornello. In 2 cases, an introduction largo resembles the French style. Conversely, the church symphonies always exhibit a more intricate articulation, whereby a single movement or a combination of several movements introduces the allegro adagio allegro sequence. So maybe when Torelli was about to compose some instrumental music for the German course, he focused his attention on the da camera model. Its opinion was speaking that the symphonies might have appeared less suitable for sponsorship, a composer seeking to establish his reputation. A team of violinists who had been trained by Torelli himself, including Pisendel and Köhler, was a congenial combination to reproduce the concertatum for voices, so with 2 violins, viola and cello. Even if Talbot did not consider the Concerti Musicali opus 6 as incredibly pioneering works, I think that they can be regarded as a development of the Bolognese writing. This concerti constitutes an hybrid and experimental work as they exhibit several formal solutions in their embryonic form. Torelli employs a 3-movement structure. I'm sorry, here. Here. A 3-movement structure, allegro, adagio allegro, or presto. I write them in green. In 7 concertos, as structures shown in the previous slide in the opus 5. In other instances, for example, in concert 4, 8, and 10, the concerto is introduced by an adagio movement in the style of a sonata. In each movement, Torelli used 3 different types of writing. A full voices writing, as a symphony alla francese, just in one case articulated into semi-choir, the concert 9, where the violins, first and seconds, played versus the basses. And we have a ritornello form used systematically in all allegro movement, and we can include 3 concertos with solo passages in this form. The concerts, I made a mistake in writing the concert 6, 10, and 12, and not 5, I'm sorry. And also we have a rich concertato writing, especially in concert 3, and also in concert 11, in the 3rd allegro, where the first and second violins, which in opus 5 often moved in 3rd, or anyway in homophonic writing, in this case are more dissociated, so that the themes are exposed by imitation between the 2 violins on a more substantial 3-part bass. To conclude, as partially intuited by Talbot in 1971, the primary musical motif of the allegro movement is development according to the principle of the Fortbildung process, a continued developing process, as theorized at the beginning of the previous century by Fischer. The intonation of the motif is followed by the elaboration for strengthness of some peculiarities, for example, a scale, a sequence of notes, a semitone movement, or some specific interval, and is concluded by an epilogue, a cadence. Torelli's Concerti Musicali Opus 6, also known as the Brandenburg Concerti, anticipate a compositional technique that will be of primary importance for the subsequent generation of musicians, composers from Germany and from Italy. Years later, this approach was used also by Antonio Vivaldi and Johann Sebastian Bach in all instrumental music in the Brandenburg concerts, in the suites, and also in many instrumental compositions in the cantatas. The Concerti Musicali, which encompass a variety of models, some of which have remained unknown until now, represent a pivotal moment in the evolution of the instrumental concert. Moreover, the fortuitous composition of these works in a German city served to redefine the circulation of the concert, and thereby established a strong point for the evolution of this genre in the Transalpine era. In this region, numerous composers, including Telemann, Pisendel, and Bach himself, consistently demonstrate to keen interest in the output of Italian composers, and they move on this style. Thank you for your attention and patience. Yes, for sure.
Okay. So if you have any questions,
Okay. Thank you very much, Valeria. Do you hear me? Yeah?
You're
No?
welcome.
Yeah? Okay. You talked about the lack of integration between the Italian milieu and the German milieu. And it's similar to that we can find in Vienna in the same period at the beginning of 18th century. I don't know if you can hear me.
I cannot listen everything, every word. I'm sorry. Sì.
One of the first composer
Yeah.
who go over this gap is the brother of Giovanni Bononcini, Antonio Maria Bononcini, who married an Austrian person, and she is the sister of a singer of Vienna court. And it's very interesting because this person come back to Italy, to Modena, with Giovanni Maria, with Antonio Maria Bononcini, and then there is a lot of story about this. It's very interesting. Can you tell us more about this topic, the lack of integration between the two different milieux? Thank you.
Sì, ho sentito. The integration was quite difficult, and I think that there were many reasons. And I understood that in the case of the Ansbach court, a very important role to be integrated was the teaching. The teaching and the formation of new musicians. And so this is the reason why Torelli maintained a good relationship inside the court. And some records inform us that also the cello player Sonetta had a similar situation, so different, because of maybe he was also teachers of cello and strings music in general in the main school near the court, where also Pisendel and other violin players were formed. And Sonetta remained in the court, at the court of Ansbach, more, and was integrated in the post as teacher in that school for a longer time than the other Italians who came back to Italy after the death of the Margraf. So one way to be integrated was the teaching, so create a relationship with the new generation of musicians. Otherwise, the musicians were totally out of the local system, as many letters confirms.
Okay, thank you very much. Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So we have our last speaker of today morning, Johannes Benke, who is well known here, of course, but I will present you for our guests here. Johannes Menke has been professor of historical composition at the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis since 2007. Before he taught music theory and Gehörbildung at the Hochschule in Freiburg, and he also was active as a radio author, organizer, and chormaster. From 2008 until 2012, he was president of the Society of Music Theory, and he's co-editor of the book series Sinfonia and of the journal Music and Aesthetic. His numerous publications deal primarily with questions of music theory and analysis, especially with regard to history and didactics. Is specialized in the music of the 17th and 16th and 17th centuries. He has published some books, has many books, so Kontrapunkt 1, die Musik der Renaissance, Kontrapunkt 2, die Musik des Barocks. And he will speak today also about Opus 6, but from a more technical point of view, I think. So thank you, Johannes.
Thank you, Agnese, for this kind introduction. And sorry for being a little bit busy with technique. It's very stressful to organize everything. Yeah, we will continue with Concerti Opus 6. And thanks to Valeria's nice presentation, we have very good information about the historical background of those pieces. As a music theorist, of course, I am interested in deeper insights into the music, a little view in the backstage part of the music, not only the nice stage design, also how it is produced and which strategies we can find behind it. And as you can see, I've called it formal and tonal strategies. I'm interested in the history of tonality, and my impression is that the genre of concerto played an important role when tonality, so thinking in major and minor with 24 keys, was well established around 1700. Let's start. So we already have seen this nice title page and the dedicatee Sophie Charlotte. Just to add that also she was the dedicatee of Opus 5 by Corelli. And if you remember my title, I've called the concertos the Brandenburg Concerti, and also the real Brandenburg Concerti by Bach were dedicated to the same family later, as you can see here. Well, this was a little bit about historical background. And the importance of Torelli is undoubtful. I just add one quotation, which shows more the reception part by Johann Joachim Quanz in 1752, where he writes about the concerto. He distinguishes concerto grosso and concerto da camera, which is the orchestral concert and the concerto, the solo concerto, we would call it later. And in paragraph 30, you can see the importance of Torelli. Die Konzerten haben ihren Ursprung von den Italienern. Torelli soll die ersten gemacht haben. So, soll gemacht haben means they say he did the first. This is not a complete overview, just some highlights in the history of concerto. And indeed, we find quite early the Torelli publications of Opus 2 and Opus 6, which have in the title the word Concerti. Georg Muffat maybe is, of course, before, but he didn't use concerto in his title. Well, let's talk now a little bit on tonality. As we all know, this is a very big issue. So when did and how did tonality in terms of 24 keys and thinking in major and minor really develop and establish? I just want to show you some steps in a more international perspective. maybe we start in England, 1665, where Christopher Simpson quite early distinguished between flat and sharp keys. In this time, you can find this not very often. It's a quite new approach. If we go to Italy later, Giovanni Bononcini, he still uses the 12th tuoni developed by Clarion in 1547. So you see, Bononcini is much more conservative than his English colleague before. Does the microphone work? Okay. Sometimes it doesn't. We stay in Italy and go to Lorenzo Penna. And maybe he's one of the first theorists there who reduced it and said, let's say we have primo modo with a minor third on D, and we have a secondo modo with a major third on C. This is the typical distinction, a major mode on C, a minor mode on D, we can observe for a long time. Charles Marsan in France does the same thing, also he distinguishes a mode majeur, a mode mineur, and he adds the typical French theory of the notes essentielles, which are the first degree finale, the third degree médiante, and the fifth degree dominant as main degrees, as columns, which establish the scale of the key. If you go to the German-speaking countries, you find samba, and samba still uses the older Baroque system of 8 modes. This is nothing to do with, not nothing, but it's not the classical octo-echos system. It's a modernized system in which you can find the old modes, like Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, but also you find the new one by Clarion, an A mode, a C mode, and you find the typical transpositions, G, Dorian, or a D mode. Well, those 8 modes, let's call them the Baroque 8 modes from the 17th century, they work perfectly with mean tone tuning. But of course, history is going on. And if we go to Heinichen, we find a kind of revolution. We find 24 keys, the famous circle, and a clear distinction between major and minor. The same in François Campion, a treatise which is not only famous for establishing major, minor, and 24 keys, but maybe more important, establishing the famous Règle des octaves. I assume all here know the Règle des octaves, the rule of the octave. One could emphatically say it's the first harmonic theory of major and minor, giving an information about the most typical chords on the degrees of a basso continuo in major and minor. This theory, if it is a theory, some people say it's not a theory, but I would say it is a theory, existed also before, but this was the first print we know where we can find the complete Règle des octaves. We find it similarly in Francesco Gasparini, and also he distinguishes modi con terza maggiore and modi con terza minore. Okay. And the rule of the octave, of course. Same here. Oh, I see. I did a mistake. Maybe it was an automatic mistake in the program. Please do not copy or photograph it. François Campion is 1716. Forgive me. I see it cannot be everything 1722. There is a mistake in the system. So please don't pay attention on the last 4 years. But 1722, Rameau is true. We have the Traité de l'harmonie. We all know with the invention of basse fondamentale and the idea of renversement and many other ideas, we still find, of course, the major and minor mode, and we still find the rule of the octave. But now we find reasons for it, thanks to la basse fondamentale. If we think that major and minor now was well established and everybody accepted this. This obviously was not true, because we find still later in Benedetto Marcello's famous Il Teatro alla Moda, this satirical writing about modern opera composers, that they are so well educated, ironically, that they think that it's only major and minor exists. So this indicates clearly Benedetto Marcello didn't agree with this simplification. Well, this was a very short overview, where we can say our concerto and this history around 1700s, it's in the middle of this development. So we already have seen in Valeria's presentation a short overview of the 12 concerti of Opus 6. Here you find how I tried to order them. You find always in white the concerti in major mode and red in minor mode. And I think it was similar in Valeria's graphic. So we said we have 6 concerti and then the 6 later concerti, 7 to 12. And we could build groups. Yeah, you see first 1 in major, 2 in minor, 1 in major, 2 in minor. And in the second big group, 7 to 12, we find always pairs. 2 in major, 2 in minor, 2 in major. What's about the keys used by Torelli? Of course, Torelli did not use 24 keys, clear. He has a more reduced variety of modes. You see always an order in fifths. In the major modes, you can see they are used A major, D major, D major, C major, F major, B flat major, no E flat major, no E major. And this is the order in which they appear. So obviously, he decided to pair them with fifth G major, D major, then a certain gap, C major, F major, and then, very strange in the end, B flat major, and last concerto, A major. Always a great effect if you play the concerti after each other. And concerning minor, we have a similar picture. We find B minor, E minor, A minor, D minor, G minor, C minor. Again, no F minor, and of course, no F sharp minor. And again, we find the pairs of EB, GC, AD chosen by Torelli. Well, this is a possibility to explain his choice of keys. The next question is which keys are used in the concerti? Because a concerto not only has one key, it has a main key, but mostly the middle movement has a different key. Here you find an overview of all the 12 concerti. And maybe the first impression might be red and white are mixed, mostly. We have some exceptions here. We have a concerto only red, or one only white. But most of them, they mix major and minor. How do they mix major and minor? All of us, we know that the very typical way is to go to the relative major in minor or vice versa. So how does it, which versions does Torelli really prefer? This is the result of my investigation. And you can see in major concertos, he goes 3 times to the 6th degree, which is the relative minor. So obviously, this is the most often used tonal disposition. Staying in the major concertos, sometimes he remains in one key, but to give a certain variety, he starts the middle movement in the tonality of the 5th degree. Then it's a little bit more interesting. We will find it once in Concerto 8. very typically going to the fifth degree in the middle movement, but we only found it once. Or he does something which is very typical in France. He mixes major into minor. Also, this appears only once in Concerto 12, this famous A major concerto in the end. Going to the minor modes, we find a similar picture. Also here, 4 variations, and 2 of them are used twice. So twice he goes from the major tonality and the minor tonality to the third degree, which is the relative major. And twice he goes to the fifth degree, but used as a minor key, of course. And then we find 2 single variants. One is going to the sixth degree, has a similar effect than going to the third degree, because you also have the change of minor to major and back. Or once in Concerto 9, he stays all the time in the main tonality. Well, to summarize, when I did this investigation, I was a little bit surprised that he uses so many possibilities, because I assumed before maybe he uses 3 or 4 variants, but for 12 concerti, 8 different dispositions is a lot. Let's go closer to tonality. So it's a big question, what is tonality? But there are different aspects establishing tonality. One aspect is, how do I start my piece? Well, how does Torelli start his concerti in Opus 6? You can see now an overview of all 12 concerti. I only show the bass voice, because the bass voice gives us the harmonic beginning. And you find on the right side of the screen always the bass progressions. Sometimes bass progressions correspond to harmonic progressions. Sometimes you have inversions, like here. And then I have added Roman numerals. Okay, if we start, we find 151, 151. This is the best way to open a tonal piece, I think. Or 153. Well, the 3, of course, is an inversion of this first degree. We find 171 here in the 4th concerto, which is also an inversion. Again, 151, 13271, which is also based on the main idea of 151, but with inversions. 111111115 in Concerto Settimo, a simplified version of 151. Then he modulates immediately. Again, 151, 151, 15, and jump into another key, again 15. This is an exception, and we will talk later on that piece. Again, 151 with diminution in the bass, and 151, or many 151s. Well, gives us a clear picture. Obviously, he prefers 151. How to continue a tonal progression? Well, here we have to talk about the rule of the octave. Among scholars, there's a certain discussion. How should the rule of the octave be understood? One party says, rule of the octave is a scheme for a scale in the bass. And the other party says, no, it's more, it's an information for every appearance of those notes. It's only the order as a scale. As you can see here, I belong to party 2, and this is an evidence for it. It's an anonymous treatise, and you find the rule of the octave above with the typical chords in G major. It's a bit more than the octave, you see. Here it goes to the 5th degree, so a 12th. And then you find something very interesting below. You find a bass progression with degrees And obviously, the purpose is to say, this is the third degree, and you have to take this chord. This is the fifth degree. You have to take this chord, and so on. Can we observe something similar in Torelli? Yes, we can. If we do it, it's very easy to analyze a bass like this movement. Yeah, you see in red the opening in C major, and then green modulation to G, and everything corresponds mainly to the rule of the octave. Let's have a look now a little bit to the top voices. Because the bass does not give any information, every information we need for the counterpoint of a piece. So if you look only this bass, maybe some very, very well-educated people here will see, this has to be following order of upper voices. And what he does here is maybe a kind of composition where the upper voices were composed first. You see here a description by Mauritius Vogt, and he calls this a meta-bassis, which is something between anabassis and catabassis, so it's both. Or in Latin, it's a transgressio, because the voices are crossing. Trahe me post me is a text very suitable for this technique. We find almost the same example in Meinrad Spies with the same terms. Some people today, they call it leapfrogging. I don't know why, maybe it sounds funny, but we have an historical term for that technique, so let's use it. This is a vocal music example. If you like, we could perform it here. You can sing the bass, we can sing a soprano voice, entering on the second beat, and the middle voice entering one note higher, so this is soprano, and second soprano. Let's try to perform it. 3, 4. And so on, let's fade out, fade out. I think the technique becomes clear. We have a series of seconds ascending, as we have seen in the example already before. Third, we bring a second resolution, next second, and it's done always with crossings. So we can find it in the piece where we have seen the bass before. Now we hope we find Spotify again, and we can listen to the piece. Disappeared? No, here it is. Has a very powerful effect, especially because Torelli starts here with a third containing a B natural, and then there later comes a B flat, and this produces a certain tension. Well, let's conclude with analysis of an entire movement. How can we imagine the strategy of unfolding tonality in a piece? If you only look at the bass, maybe you remember this one piece we have spoken before, with this exceptional beginning, 1/5 in D minor and 1/5 in F major. In the following graphic, I tried to show, sorry. How one could explain this unfolding of tonality in the piece. In that piece, we will listen to it in the end. It doesn't have very characteristic motives, so you are really attracted as listener by this development. And I tried to show all the aspects mentioned before. You can find the degrees beneath the bass voice. You can find with the brackets above the development following the idea of ascending thirds, in addition, of course, also fifths. You see the entire first phrase is transposed 1/5 higher. Then comes a central part with quite stable sounds and two phrases, concluding phrases. Before we listen to it, I want to to give you some information about the counterpoint we find here. So you see only the outer voices. And I think the design of outer voices plays a very important role in the strategy of the piece. It starts with a 3-5 progression. Also here we find a 5-3 progression, maybe the inversion of it. And if you look at the intervals, you find the first two phrases only 3-5 and some 7th, always prepared, of course. Then appears here a first 6th kind of revolution. And of course, it's a very special 6th. It's the Neapolitan 6th in D minor. And then the 6th plays an important role in preparing the final cadence. So in parallel motion or with a 7-6 progression. Let's listen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for this, for letting us look inside Torelli's workshop, Werkstatt. Any questions? Ralph? Or comments? Or yes, Martin Kirnbauer.
A very simple question. You showed this Relo d'Octave from the manuscript in Bologna.
Mhm.
Do you think there's a certain relationship between Torelli and this manuscript?
No, it's
No,
very
but-
difficult to investigate. One should do, of course, yeah.
Yes, it's late maybe. Everyone is a little tired, but for me it's very interesting just to see how you can analyze, of course, this musical from this perspective and from this perspective of tonality, of course. But if you compare the different concerts, can you find in relation to these different tonal schemes or plans, can you find some the same strategy, so to speak, or what can you observe in this regard?
What I did today was only a start. You see, some of the approaches have something to do with corpus research, where you have to analyze many pieces for having a better idea. And I think this strategy here in this movement is quite exceptional. You can already find at the beginning. I would say it's quite advanced, quite complex, and a comparison would show us that other movements are maybe a little bit more, lighter, easier to understand.
Mark.
Thank you for this. I'm trying to formulate a question still in my mind because it brought so many things to the surface. Also thinking about Bononcini, who indeed talks about 12 modes, but says in practice we only use 3, the Dorian, the Aeolian, and the Ionian, which are major, minor, and Dorian. And you find that a little bit, of course, Colonnas at the same time still uses much more of a modal writing, also because the acoustics of San Petronio do not allow you to do everything that he does there. And even Torelli in San Petronio has a different tonal language than what you see here. Do you think it may have to do with the fact that he published this dedicated to the court of Ansbach, that he was actually daring to go a lot farther in this new tonal language that was actually surfacing in the last decade of the 17th century? Or is it, that the or part is still the part that I'm trying to formulate for myself, but maybe I'll get there.
It's a possibility that has to do with this dedication. But I think in general, the concerto was so interesting for composers because they had a certain freedom there. So remember this big term, Stilus Fantasticus, where Kircher says you're free in Stilus Fantasticus from text. This being free from text also means you are free from liturgy, liturgical modes, and so on. So you can do what you want, just music. And this was the world in which major and minor were developing, I think.
Yeah, because and the idea that concerto was sort of the genre that allows to do that. It's also interesting that sometimes he names the same piece, Sinfonia, or even sonata,
well, yes.
and sometimes on the same manuscript, if you look at different part book. So I'm still trying to figure out if he actually thinks of a difference between those 3, or if concerto is really some kind of a lab where you can develop those ideas. But thank you for this presentation.
Thank you. So if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you. Thank you, Hannes Menke, again, and thank all the speakers of this morning. Thank you very much. We will meet at 2 again with the following presentations. So looking forward to hear more on Torelli. Thank you very much.